boš kaj zdaj, karkoli, kaj drugače, dobivaš signal. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. Ok, ne, sem.
Ladies and gentlemen, the forum will be continuing shortly with the presentation titled Winning the 20s, a Leadership Agenda for the Next Decade. Please take your seats.
The presentation titled Winning the 20s, a Leadership Agenda for the Next Decade. Please welcome Mr. Martin Reeves from the Boston Consulting Group.
We've heard a lot from government officials on the role of governments in facing the planetary challenges of the next decade. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to share a business perspective on the contribution that business may make to the next decade too, where I think an equally momentous set of changes is necessary. So let me start first by saying I think it's probably one of the worst times in history for complacency. If we look at the top-ranking companies in the world in 2009, we see that those companies came from 6 nations. We see that it was dominated by energy companies. And if we zoom ahead to 2019, we see that only 2 of the companies are common between the 2 lists. So really, already we're in a world where leadership doesn't last very long. Furthermore, those resource-based companies have been replaced by technology companies. Also, if you look closely, in 2009, there was one company that was a so-called platform business or an ecosystem-based business. In 2019, 70% of the largest companies in the world are now ecosystem-based companies. In other words, they are communities of companies pursuing a common purpose. So really, the unit of analysis has changed overnight from the company to the ecosystem. And that's not merely a change in competitive strategy. That is a change in the conception of what strategy is. So the question really is, where are we heading in the next decade? And I'll share with you some personal speculations about what it will take to win in 2029. My approach is unashamedly corporate, what corporations have to do to win the next decade. But I think many of the lessons may be applicable to governments and nations too. I'll let you be the judge of that. Another preliminary remark. If we look at long-term growth rates, so here we see the projections from the IMF of the growth rate over time, how the forecast has declined. We see a secular decline in long-term growth rates. And I believe that this is an inevitability of the aging of the global population. So I would expect to see that we'll have lower growth rates over time and also lower average returns. Now, we have right now what the economists call a compulsive stimulus model, which is we use fiscal and monetary stimulus to try to maintain these rates of growth. But sooner or later, we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that structural growth, aggregate growth, may be trending down. So actually, I can make a second statement, which is I also think it's the worst time in history to be average. In fact, it's already the worst time in history to be average for a company in the sense that the gap between the performance of the top-ranking companies and the average companies is diverging very widely. So the change agenda that we heard in relation to countries, I think, applies every bit as dramatically to companies too. So let me share some thoughts on how companies may be competing in 2029, because I think it's not just an issue of trying harder and being more aggressive. I think we have to actually compete differently. So I'll share some thoughts on how the logic of competition potentially changes away from the historic logic of scale and position. I'll share some thoughts on how that actually changes what we mean by organization, how companies are organized. I'll say something about the massive change agenda that implies and how our current managerial technologies for dealing with change are really not up to the task, and so we require reinvention here. I'll talk about the need for a new equation, a new paradigm of how we harness human resources, especially diversity. And finally, I think where the previous discussions and this session may meet is I'll talk about the connection between corporate performance and the health of a society and the Earth ecosystem overall, and how those agendas can no longer remain separate. So first of all, I think we'll be facing a new logic of competition. Historically, companies have competed on scale, the idea being that the bigger you are, the more market share you have, the more cumulative experience you have, the lower costs you have, the higher profits you have in a virtuous cycle. It's a static logic of competition. I think we now have the need to compete on the rate of learning. What do I mean by that? Well, we have a need to compete on the rate of learning in that we need to learn about a changing world, a fast-changing world. I think we have the possibility of doing so because we now have machine learning, which at individual tasks is exceeding the capability of human experts in more and more tasks, not just relatively simple games like chess and Go, but also relatively complex tasks like reading an X-ray, for example, or reading a skin lesion, diagnosing a skin lesion. We also have the competitive necessity to compete on the rate of learning because some companies, and I'll show you some examples, are already doing so. So if we're competing not on scale but on the rate of learning, we need to use ecosystems as the information antenna of the company. Companies need to be profoundly externally facing. Large companies on average are very internally facing, but you can't adapt to an environment unless you're facing and interacting with that environment. And so one function of these multi-company ecosystems is actually as the information antenna for the so-called new oil, which is fresh proprietary data from which one can learn. So this may be feeling at this point like more of the same in terms of the digital revolution, but actually I think there'll be a profound shift. So the drivers of the growth today, the technology-driven growth up to today, have been two-sided marketplaces, cheap computing power, mobile telecommunications. I think the next wave of growth drivers will be things like machine learning and also the application of the ecosystem idea to actually between companies, Internet of Things or B2B ecosystems. And it's likely that the logic for winning in business to business is actually going to be quite different. It's probably going to be much more vertically structured than horizontally structured. Fourthly, that growth equation, that declining growth equation that I talked about, in a world of lower aggregate growth, we can't merely reposition ourselves for growth. In other words, we can't say, go to China, go into this technology or that technology. I think actually we need to create growth through innovation and imagination, and those are not two words that one associates with automatically with large companies and governments. So really we need to imagine new sources of demand and new sources of need and create those possibilities entrepreneurially. And lastly, I've been doing business strategy for 30 years. Essentially the discipline has been about one question, which is how good is my game relative to competitors? But one of the challenging things about business today is just the contraction of life cycles. So the average company used to live, amongst US public companies, used to live for 70 years. Now that number is 37 years. The average time that a leader in business would remain a leader in their industry was 10 years or more, and now that's less than half of that number. So really we need to think about a second question, which is not only how good is my game, but how resilient is my game, or how long does my game last? And we don't currently have financial systems or metrics that enable us to do that. So this really is the logic of pillar one of the agenda, which is compete on a new logic of competition. Now this may sound a little futuristic to the average company, but the reality is that some companies are already there. So I could mention Google, Alibaba, the Japanese company Recruit. Here I show the example of Netflix. Netflix is gathering data from its consumer ecosystem, processing that data with more and more effective predictive algorithms as to what consumers will want to watch next, giving a better customer experience and better economics as a result, creating a self-fueling cycle which creates the so-called winner-takes-all effects or network effects in ecosystem businesses, and creating what the economist has called super companies, a group of companies that are outperforming regular companies, essentially by competing effectively with a very low asset intensity on a superior ability to learn. So I think this agenda is coming to more and more companies. Now, if we buy some of what I just said, we're competing on the rate of learning, then I think this necessarily requires that we reinvent what we think of as organization. So what do we mean by organization today? Typically we mean human beings arranged hierarchically, making decisions on human timescales, maybe days or weeks or months, around the affairs of the company, the profit maximization of the company. Well, already this model, this conception of organization is false. For a start, we have a spatial expansion, so we move from the gray box vertically upwards, in that the unit of analysis is increasingly, for 7 of the world's top companies in terms of market capitalization, the unit of analysis is already the ecosystem. So we're making decisions about larger organizations, not all of which the parts we own and control. Secondly, the timescales that are relevant for decision making are now beyond the human timescale in both directions. So the obvious part of that is the millisecond timescales of algorithmic trading and so on. We need to find indirect ways of managing very short timescales. But also, as we've heard in the earlier part of this session, we're sort of at a turning point with respect to geopolitics, the geopolitics of technology, the rise of China. So we have to think about very, very slow changes too, which change the context for business. And then thirdly, The idea that an organization is a hierarchical human decision-making process is already not true for many leading companies, in that we have synergistic combinations of algorithms and humans making decisions. So I would redefine organization as synergistic combinations of humans and algorithms that make decisions on a broader range of timescales, on a broader range of geographic scales, spatial scales. And if that's the organization we want to design, whether it be for a company or for government, then we really need to solve for 5 challenges. The first is the integration of the information systems of companies and governments so that we have integrated learning loops. There's no point in speeding up one part of the decision process if that very fast result is then delivered to a hierarchy that takes weeks or months to pass the decision up and down the hierarchy. We need to make closed-loop learning systems for the fast part of these processes. We need to think about the division of labor. The good news is that many of the routine tasks of business will be automated and taken over by machine learning algorithms. The challenging part of that equation is that we'll need to therefore specify, well, what is it that the humans do? Well, there are plenty of things that are not getting done today, new needs that we need to deal with. We need to deal with political analysis as a dimension of competition. We need to think about algorithmic governance, which is, can we trust the algorithms? Are the algorithms trustworthy and unbiased? And are they doing what they think we're doing? Because today's machine learning is intransparent. It's a black box. It's hard to tell how is the algorithm reaching the result that it's reaching. Thirdly, we need to do a lot of work on human-machine interfaces so that the humans can tinker with the algorithms and understand why the algorithms are doing what they do, and to complement them with complementary tasks, such as a focus on human-to-human communications, governance, innovation, imagination, and the like, which requires a lot of work on interfaces. We need to leverage ecosystems as the information antenna for companies. And then also we need to think about rethink management. What does it mean to lead a synergistic combination of humans and algorithms making decisions on a broader range of timescales? Because we can't lead directly, we can't necessarily intervene in algorithmic decisions directly, and neither can we fully control the emergent properties of business ecosystems. So we need a different concept of management and governance to cover that. Again, this may sound a little futuristic to the average company, but the reality is that this is already how some organizations are behaving. So let's take Alibaba for an example. Alibaba believes in what it calls the self-tuning company. Self-tuning means, like the radio in your iPhone, you don't have to turn a dial to tune it into the right frequency. It automatically finds the right frequency. So the analogy is that the inside of the organization, be it the HR processes, the planning processes, the resource allocation system, are all tuning themselves and learning and adapting to a changing external environment. So what we have is not automation, we have autonomization, which is the automation of the learning process. And that involves a number of things. That involves an algorithmic view of organization. It involves trying to figure out how to make large organizations outward-facing rather than inward-facing. It means small cycles of decision-making. It means a less top-down, rational choice model of management and decision-making, and a more bottom-up, empirical, adaptive experimentation-based conception of management. And it involves getting the hierarchy out of the way of the fast automated processes and refocusing human creativity on high levels of cognition. So while the algorithms may be doing the correlative thinking, what goes with what, the humans will be doing the causative thinking, what causes what, or the counterfactual thinking, how could things be different, the innovative thinking. Some more evidence that this is not science fiction. So some companies, like Amazon, are already distinguishing between human tasks and machine tasks. Microsoft is one of the first companies in the world with a C-suite position that deals with algorithmic governance, issues of trust and bias concerning the performance of the algorithms. A lot of companies are working on the design of these human-machine interfaces, and many companies are building a continuous evolutionary model rather than the static model of organization. So all of that, if you'll suspend disbelief and believe just 10% of what I've said and predicted, then all of that implies a tremendous amount of change. Now, there's probably no weaker part to our managerial toolkit than the tools of change management. So let me share with you the numbers about change management. 1/3 of companies at any time are embarked upon some major change program, some whole company change program. It's sometimes called a turnaround, a delayering, a transformation, but a major change program. We know that 75% of those efforts will fail to meet their objectives. 75% of those companies that are embarked upon major change will fail to meet the average performance norms of their sector. And furthermore, the cost of this is enormous, because if you look at the net present value difference, the value generation difference between the companies that succeed with major change and those that fail with major change, it's roughly 10 percentage points of shareholder return for roughly a 10-year period, which is the enterprise value of the company. So imagine somebody offered you a bet. 1/3 of you can bet the value of a company on a philosophy whereby you will lose 75% of the time. Not very good. So we really need a better approach to change. And I think the opportunity here is to bring the information revolution into the HR function, into the organizational function, so that we can have a more scientific and a more evidence-based approach to change. So one part of that is stop talking about change management in the singular as if there is only one type of change. And that one type of change is usually what I call a planned itinerary, which is a very planned, top-down, Gantt chart-driven approach to change. So let's imagine that change is like climbing one of the beautiful mountains around here, and your objective is to go from a dark, low place to a brighter, more attractive high place. There are actually different types of route that you may follow. You may go straight up the hill where you know where you're starting, you know where you're trying to end up on the summit, and you can see every step along the way and have a plan that says we would reach base station 1 by day 1 and base station 2 by day 2. This is typically the very rational project management-oriented approach to change that is totally appropriate if the change is relatively simple, clear ends, clear beginnings, and clear means. So, for instance, if you're Staples, the US stationery retailer that's looking to cut costs by, say, 6% or 8%, it's a perfectly good approach. If, on the other hand, you're Starbucks and you are trying to improve customer loyalty, you know where you want to get to. You may even know the number that you want to hit for customer loyalty, but you actually don't know precisely how you're going to get there. It's more like crossing a river where you need to feel the stepping stones under the water in order to reach the other side. Which, of course, calls for a totally different change philosophy. This calls for an adaptive approach to change, where you try things, see where they work, and you're constantly adapting a rough plan. Or if you're like John Deere, where you're trying to figure out how to do agricultural data-based ecosystems, you're trying to bring the information revolution to agriculture, you may not actually know the final destination. You may know whether what you're currently trying works better than what you used to have, but you actually don't know you can't necessarily visualize the end state. So this is akin to climbing up a mountain through a forest where you can't actually see the peak. Your legs can tell you which way is up, and you just have to keep tracking in the right direction. So again, we're calling for an adaptive approach to change. If you're Google trying to figure out how to bring internet to developing countries using helium balloons, then there may be no map of how to do that. It may not even be a viable business, in which case you're probably an approach of scouting and wandering and creating a map is probably your first step, which actually calls for an approach to change management which is more like exploration and map making and less like a planned process of change. And if you're in a situation like Best Buy, another US retailer that essentially is trying to escape from a relatively dire short-term situation, then actually it may be like escaping from a swamp, where you know where you want to escape from, but you don't actually have an ultimate destination. And the imperative is to take rapid, pragmatic, top-down action rather than the best action, providing you can do so more quickly. So de-averaging change. And if we de-average change, and my experience is that a major change program, be it in a government agency or a company, consists of multiple change components, you can do two things. you can adopt the right strategy to change, and also you can begin to bring data and analytics. So I don't have time to show you an example of that, but I can tell you that if you analyze the transformations, the planned itinerary transformations of 3,000 companies, then certain factors come out as being much more important than others. So, for example, it turns out that the most important predictor of success in planned itinerary change is actually when you begin. If you begin while your results are relatively favorable compared to other companies, in other words, if you're trying to turn around the successful company, your chances of success are considerably greater than if you wait for a deterioration of financial or competitive results. I can tell you that if you don't change the leadership, if you don't challenge the people that were the previous architects of the previous business model, then you're likely to have a low probability of success. I can tell you that if you are successful, more of the value is likely to come from growth than it is from cost reduction. So a change program mainly focused on cost reduction is less effective. So this is something about how we need to bring science to the change process. Now, of course, everything that I'm saying changes the human element of the equation. Machine learning will reinvent the future of work whether we like it or not. The relatively tedious routine tasks will be taken over by machine learning. And that will become a competitive necessity. Once your competitors have done that, you'll have no choice but to do the same thing. Which leaves us with a question which has generated a considerable amount of fear, which is, will that mean a necessary decline in the amount of jobs? Will that lead to an intractable retraining challenge? Well, I think actually the thing about this question is it's not a passive question, it's an active question. It depends upon the actions of the people doing the change. So I'd suggest that one major opportunity is to harness the power of diversity. Now, we may already be bored with the topic of diversity because we've been talking about it passionately for at least 10 years, and it's very hard to find a CEO that stands against diversity. But the sad fact is that we've made relatively little progress. So in the US, if you take a certain definition of seniority, then 26% of managers in companies were female, and if you apply the same definition 10 years later, that number has only moved by 1%. So a lot of talk, but actually not much action. Now, the good news is that diversity used to be an ethical proposition. In other words, the idea was that we need to employ people from different backgrounds, different orientations, different genders, different disciplines, because it's the right thing to do, it's the fair thing to do. And of course, that's still the case. But the great news is we now have a business case for this. So the future that I've laid out for you requires more resilience and more innovation, and we now know that diversity predicts growth. So companies which are more diverse will 5 years later have a higher percentage of their revenues coming from new products. So we now have a business case for diversity. Furthermore, it's a very strong business case because it turns out that the multidimensionality of diversity is actually additive. So if I take the diversity effect from national background and the diversity effect from educational background and the diversity effect from a gender and the diversity effect from cognitive diversity, different ways of thinking about problems, then basically these effects are broadly additive and potentially very powerful. Now, the mysterious thing is that many of the things I've talked about, many of the required changes are really hard. If I say, you're not an ecosystem-based company, you need to basically create a successful ecosystem. That's a very hard thing. That involves a lot of capabilities, a lot of tough competitive challenges. But at least in theory, we should have perfect control over who we hire and who we promote. So it's a little bit of a mystery that business is not availing itself of this massive and missed opportunity. So my theory is that basically the obstacle is two things. One of them is accountability. How many of us that know somebody that was fired because they didn't meet their performance targets? Probably quite a lot of us. How many of us know somebody that was fired because they didn't meet their diversity targets? That's much rarer. So we apply a different level of accountability to this topic, but I think we need an equal level of accountability. And then the other one is bias masquerading as meritocratic intentions. So we may say, yes, I'm in favor of diversity, but I also want to make sure that I'm hiring the best people. And I say, well, list the characteristics of the best people. And you may say, well, they're knowledgeable about the industry, they're assertive, and you can see the bias there. I'm basically saying hire people that are already successful, which essentially counts in the biases that we already have in the working population. And I'm saying some things that may be more characteristics of male managers than female managers on average. So sometimes good intentions about meritocracy actually mask biases that explain the relative lack of progress on the right-hand side here. So let's come back to an old chestnut, another thing we've been talking about for years. I stopped I was going to sustainability conferences for 10 or 15 years. I sort of stopped going because I became very bored. It was the same people talking about the same stuff while the planet was burning, while inequality was increasing. There was just something very repetitive and ineffective about this topic of optimizing for social and business value at the same time. Well, in a sense, I think one of the speakers said it earlier, sometimes, unfortunately, it takes a crisis, it takes some real sense of urgency to actually get something done. And I think planetary and social issues have become NPV relevant to companies. They can feel it in their wallets. I've got a personal example of this. I just moved from the east coast of the U.S. to the west coast of the U.S. In the east coast of the U.S., I had a house on the coast, and essentially I had a declining value to my house and an increasing insurance cost because of the flood risk on the east coast of the U.S., which of course is climate related. On the west coast, where I moved to in the San Francisco area, I still actually don't have my house insured because it's hard to find a major insurer that will insure a house which is next to some trees because of the risk of wildfires. So it's really becoming very real, especially to industries like the insurance industry whose risks extend into the future. Now, Aristotle had, of course, there's absolutely nothing new to this. It's not just the 15 years I spent going to sustainability conferences. Going back to Aristotle ethics, Aristotle had two concepts of economics. One of them was crematistica, which is profit maximization. And basically, wealth maximization as an end in itself, Aristotle saw as being unsustainable. Essentially, an unconstrained maximization problem sooner or later blows up. He had a second concept, oikonomia, which of course means literally the affairs of the household, and gave rise to both the word economics and the word ecosystem, which was the art of managing a household. In other words, we may generate surplus resources, we may generate profit, but for a higher purpose. In this case, the welfare of the household, but by extension, we could say the welfare of society. Now, we could update Aristotle a little bit by doing a natural language processing, a machine learning, an artificial intelligence analysis of company investor statements. And we divided companies into crematistica companies, mainly financially driven companies, and oikonomia companies, which are basically purpose-driven companies, which are very easy to distinguish by the way that they talk to their investors. And we asked the question, which is more effective in generating value in the long term? And the interesting answer is that the maximization of wealth as a goal, as an end in itself, isn't a particularly effective way of maximizing wealth. The oikonomia companies were actually more effective. So it's a bit like trying to be happy. One of the worst ways of being happy is to try desperately to be happy. One of the worst ways of making friends is to try desperately to be friendly to everybody. In the same way, there may be something very short-sighted about the over-financialization of the corporation. So I think it's very important that we change up a gear on this topic too, old though it is, and think about every company having a stated purpose of social utility, about CEOs stepping up and actually getting involved proactively in shaping the regulation and the solutions to tough challenges like inequality and global warming. Figuring out ways of not just saying that we co-optimize for both social and business value, but actually having the metrics and the accountability to do so. When the Business Roundtable, 181 CEOs came out, I think it was last week, and said basically that it wasn't just shareholders whose interests should be maximized, it was multiple stakeholders. Some people dismiss this as mere words or a formula which would dilute the accountability of business, but I see it as a powerful step in the right direction. These CEOs did not have to make that statement. They made it probably because they all had an intuition that this equation was not working. So, ending on something a little bit practical, what are the concrete things that corporations could do to avoid becoming average, avoid becoming that unattractive average line on the declining growth chart, and also being also undistinguished, average in the sense of not contributing to these broader social and planetary challenges we talked about? I think the first thing is to emphasize a uniqueness mindset. In other words, if your vision statement or your statement of purpose, if you cover up the name of the company, looks just like somebody else's, or you can't even tell which industry is being talked about, then it's probably just harmless poetry and really isn't doing its job. A purpose statement should create discomfort, not describe what the company is doing, but it should create discomfort between an aspirational state and a current state. Secondly, if you set very modest goals, then you'll probably achieve them. I think some of the challenges that we talked about are totally unreasonable, so-called wicked problems that we need to set very ambitious goals for. Thirdly, I think we need to step away from merely optimizing yesterday's game. We need to create new business models. We need to create new paths to both growth, which is in the self-interest of companies, but also ones which are consistent with the planetary and the social priorities. So we use the word sustainable in business in two places. We talk about sustainable competitive advantage, and we talk about sustainability, ecological sustainability, and the two really don't have much to do with each other. We need to bring them together by actually having sustainable business model innovation. We need to be unique to our customers. One of the wonderful things that the technologies that we now have can do is mass customization. We can actually delight individual customers by offering the particular combination of attributes that they want in their products. And focus less on benchmarking and industry norms. Industries are increasingly irrelevant. We need to consider a bigger system because ecosystems cross industries, and also companies are embedded in their social environment. So we really need to look at a bigger equation. I am as efficient as my competitors is not a sufficiently ambitious basis for doing business. We need to compete on the rate of learning. We need to learn new things that we don't currently have solutions for. So we need to innovate our way and learn our way towards new solutions to new challenges, which sounds like an innocent statement, but that really changes, as I've shown with the 5 pillars, the fabric of if you like, the mental software for business. And 7, we need to go beyond what is being directly demanded to us. A lot of companies will point to their customer satisfaction survey to justify the status quo. They'll point to the fact that 90% of their customers love them, which is, of course, very circular because the ones that don't love them are not their customers. So really we need to preempt and delight and surprise and go beyond the expectation. In some ways, the expectations of corporations and governments are extraordinarily low. Over multiple years, we've seen a declining trust in business and in government, and an increasing gap between the trust placed in governments and corporations by the intelligentsia and by the mass population. And we need to correct that, I think, by exceeding expectations, not merely meeting expectations. So, bottom line, I think corporations have an important role, a critical role in helping governments and NGOs to meet the planetary and social and economic challenges that we've been talking about. And if we look at this as an opportunity, then really it's a wonderful opportunity to reinvent work, to eliminate the drudgery of routine work, to create a fairer world where we have more diversity in the workforce, to reinvent how we train people, and to have a more trustworthy social contract between business and society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will continue in a minute with the presentation of the BSF Distinguished